Hey everyone, tonight we're stepping into one of history's darkest chapters, the daily reality of enslaved life in 1700s America. A story that demands our attention not for entertainment, but for understanding. The systematic dehumanization, the resilience, the communities forged in the face of unimaginable cruelty. Before we begin, please take a moment to like and subscribe if this content matters to you. Let me know in the comments where you're listening from. These stories connect us across time and distance in ways that really matter. Now, settle in. Maybe dim the lights. Get comfortable. Because what we're about to explore together isn't easy, but it's essential. The voices that were silenced. The lives that were reduced to property. The humanity that persisted despite everything designed to crush it. This isn't about distant statistics or abstract historical concepts. This is about real people, mothers and fathers, children and elders, who woke up every morning in a world that told them they were worth nothing, yet somehow found ways to love, to hope, to survive, and to resist. So let's honor their memory by listening carefully to what their daily lives actually looked like. Before dawn broke across the plantation, before the roosters announced another day of bondage, you were already stirring on the hard wooden floor of the quarters. Sleep was a luxury measured in hours, not comfort. The horn would sound soon. That brass instrument of awakening that meant your body belonged to someone else for the next 16 hours, maybe 18 if the work demanded it. You had learned to wake before the horn, because those few moments of quiet darkness were the only time that felt entirely your own. The quarters stretched in long, low buildings designed for maximum occupancy and minimum comfort. 20, sometimes 30 people shared a single structure, families crammed into spaces no larger than a modern bedroom closet. Children slept pressed against their mothers, husbands against wives, when families were fortunate enough to remain together. Privacy was a concept that belonged to the master's house, not here among the weathered wooden planks that let in winter wind and summer heat with equal indifference. Your clothing was distributed twice yearly, if you were fortunate. Once if the harvest had been poor, or the master felt particularly economical. The fabric was coarse Osnaburg, a cheap cotton weave that scratched against skin and held sweat like a punishment. Men received 2 shirts and 2 pairs of trousers. Women got 2 shifts and perhaps a single skirt. Children made do with a long shirt that served as their entire wardrobe until they grew old enough to work the fields full-time. Shoes, when they came at all, arrived once per year, rough brogans with wooden soles that offered little protection against stones, thorns, or the endless miles you would walk between sunrise and sunset. Many went barefoot by choice rather than endure the blisters and cuts those ill-fitting shoes inflicted. Feet grew hard as leather, collused into natural protection against the ground that would support your labor for decades. The horn sounded, that daily signal that your time was no longer yours. From the big house, the overseer emerged, already mounted on horseback. Carrying the tools of his trade, a long whip coiled at his side, a pocket watch that measured your worth in minutes, and eyes that had learned to see human beings as units of production. Some overseers were enslaved men themselves, placed in positions of authority that created impossible choices between survival and solidarity. Others were poor white men who took the job because it paid better than their alternatives and satisfied something dark in their nature. Breakfast, if it could be called that, was consumed quickly and without pleasure. A portion of cornmeal mush, sometimes sweetened with molasses if supplies were adequate, sometimes salted pork that had seen better days. The portions were calculated to provide just enough energy to sustain heavy labor without creating unnecessary expense. Children often went to the fields hungry, their growing bodies receiving the same rations as adults, despite their different needs. The walk to the fields began in darkness and continued as the sun painted the horizon in colors that might have been beautiful if you had the luxury of appreciating beauty. Tobacco, rice, cotton, indigo, sugarcane, the crops varied by region, but the rhythm of agricultural bondage remained constant. Your hands, whether they belonged to a child of 8 or an elder of 60, were expected to contribute to the endless cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting that generated wealth for others. Cotton fields stretched like white oceans under the blazing sun, each plant demanding individual attention. Your fingers learned to move with mechanical precision, plucking the white fiber from its protective bowls while avoiding the sharp edges that could slice unprotected skin. The cotton sack grew heavier throughout the day, dragging behind you like an anchor that tethered you to your assigned rows. Each picker was expected to gather a specific quota, measured in pounds that increased as you demonstrated ability. The overseer rode between the rows, his horse's hooves creating small clouds of dust that settled on everything: your skin, your hair, your clothes, the cotton itself. His presence was a constant reminder that your pace was being monitored, your technique evaluated, your worth calculated in real time. The whip rarely needed to be used. Its mere presence, coiled and ready, provided sufficient motivation for most. Rice cultivation in the low country demanded different skills, but equal endurance. The fields flooded with water that reflected the sky while hiding snakes, insects, and the constant threat of disease. Workers bent at impossible angles for hours, their backs screaming protests that could not be voiced, their feet disappearing into mud that sucked at every step. The grain that would feed families across the colonies was harvested by people who rarely tasted it themselves. Sugar cane in Louisiana created its own particular version of agricultural hell. The tall stalks towered above workers who cut them down with machetes that grew heavier with each swing. The juice was sticky and attracted every flying insect in the vicinity, creating clouds of mosquitoes and flies that feasted on exposed skin while you labored. The cutting had to be completed quickly, before the cane began to sour, creating a pace that pushed human endurance beyond reasonable limits. Children as young as 6 worked alongside adults, their small hands assigned tasks, supposedly suited to their size, carrying water, picking seeds from cotton, frightening birds from ripening crops. But childhood, as a protected period of growth and learning, did not exist in the quarters. Children learned early that their value was measured by their productivity, their future determined not by potential or dreams, but by their ability to contribute to someone else's prosperity. The dinner break, when it came, lasted 30 minutes or less. Workers collapsed wherever they stood, some too exhausted to eat, others gulping down portions of cornbread and whatever vegetables might have been distributed. Water, warm from sitting in wooden buckets under the sun, tasted like salvation regardless of its temperature or purity. These brief respites were treasured not for their comfort, but for their simple absence of labor. Conversations during these breaks were conducted in whispers and careful glances. Information passed between workers like contraband. Which overseer was in a particularly foul mood, whether the master had visitors who might affect the day's routine. News from other plantations carried by those who had been permitted to travel for supplies or services. Every piece of information could prove valuable for survival. The afternoon stretched endlessly, the sun reaching its peak intensity just as fatigue began to overwhelm even the strongest workers. Heat stroke was a constant threat, but falling behind in your assigned task was a greater one. The overseer's watch ticked away minutes that translated directly into expected productivity. Fainting was not an excuse. It was a failure that might result in reduced rations, extra work assignments, or worse. Some plantations operated on the task system, where specific jobs were assigned with the promise that completion meant the end of the workday. Others followed the gang system, where everyone worked from dawn to dusk regardless of individual productivity. Neither system offered genuine respite. They simply provided different frameworks for extracting maximum labor from human bodies. Evening brought no immediate relief. The fields might be left behind, but the work continued in different forms. Firewood needed to be gathered and chopped. Meals required preparation, with whatever ingredients had been distributed or could be foraged from the edges of cultivated land. Clothing needed washing and mending by candlelight or firelight, the same garments worn day after day, until they literally fell apart. The skilled trades offered some variation from field labor, but came with their own constraints and expectations. Blacksmiths worked over forges that turned already oppressive heat into something nearly unbearable. Carpenters shaped wood with tools that were maintained better than the quarters they built. Seamstresses created clothing for the master's family while wearing clothes that barely qualified as covering. House servants faced different challenges, but not necessarily easier ones. Proximity to the master's family meant constant surveillance, higher expectations, and punishments that could be swift and severe for any perceived slight or mistake. The house slaves often lived in the attic or basement of the main residence, isolated from the community in the quarters, and viewed with suspicion by field workers who saw their better clothes and cleaner hands as signs of betrayal or favoritism. Women carried additional burdens that compounded the universal experiences of bondage. Pregnancy offered no reprieve from labor expectations. Women worked in the fields until the day they gave birth and returned as soon as they could stand. Children were weaned early so their mothers could return to full productivity. Sexual exploitation by masters, overseers, and other white men was an omnipresent threat that women had virtually no power to resist. The breeding of enslaved people was discussed and implemented with the same cold calculation applied to livestock. Women of childbearing age were valued not only for their labor, but for their reproductive capacity. Children could be sold for profit, and their existence increased the master's wealth, regardless of the emotional bonds that formed between parent and child. Families were economic units that could be dissolved at will. Husbands, wives, and children might wake up any morning to discover that some among them had been sold to settle debts, provide cash, or simply because a buyer had made an attractive offer. The marriage ceremonies that took place in the quarters, often elaborate celebrations that provided rare moments of joy and community, carried the unspoken knowledge that they could be nullified by a single business transaction. Medical care was rudimentary and focused primarily on maintaining productivity rather than comfort or long-term health. Broken bones were set because a worker with a useless limb provided no economic value. Fevers were treated because illness could spread and reduce overall plantation efficiency. But chronic pain, exhaustion, and the long-term effects of malnutrition were accepted as inevitable costs of the system. Folk medicine flourished in the quarters, passed down through generations and adapted to available resources. Elderly women who had learned healing from their own mothers became the community's primary medical practitioners, using herbs, roots, and techniques that often proved more effective than the master's physician. These women held positions of respect and authority that the plantation hierarchy could not completely suppress. Religion provided one of the few spaces where enslaved communities could gather and express themselves with some degree of autonomy. Services were often conducted in secret, in woods or fields far from the main house, where spirituals could be sung without fear of punishment, and prayers could be offered for freedom without being overheard by those who profited from bondage. The Christianity that was often imposed upon enslaved communities was carefully edited to emphasize obedience, submission, and acceptance of earthly suffering as preparation for heavenly reward. But the enslaved populations created their own interpretations, finding in biblical stories of liberation and promised lands a source of hope and resistance that owners had not intended to provide. African traditions persisted despite deliberate efforts to suppress them. Musical patterns, storytelling techniques, spiritual practices, and artistic expressions maintained connections to ancestral cultures that the Middle Passage and plantation system had attempted to sever. These traditions adapted and evolved, creating new forms of cultural expression that blended African heritage with American experiences. Education was typically forbidden with literacy laws in many colonies and states making it illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. The ability to read could provide access to information about the outside world, legal documents, or abolitionist literature that might inspire resistance. Those who learned to read did so in secret, often from sympathetic individuals or through their own determined efforts to decode written language. Despite these prohibitions, many enslaved people became literate through clandestine lessons, trading food or services for instruction, or teaching themselves using whatever materials they could access. The thirst for education was strong, driven by the understanding that knowledge represented a form of freedom that could not be easily taken away. Resistance took many forms beyond the dramatic slave revolts that captured historical attention. Daily resistance included work slowdowns, tool breaking, feigning illness, and countless small acts of defiance that extracted tiny measures of autonomy from an oppressive system. Some resistance was individual, some collective, but it was persistent and creative. Running away was attempted by thousands. Despite the severe punishments that awaited those who were captured, the Underground Railroad provided assistance to some, but most who fled had to rely on their own resourcefulness, knowledge of local geography, and enormous courage to attempt journeys that could result in freedom or death. The hiring out system allowed some enslaved people to work for wages, though most of their earnings went to their owners. These arrangements could provide small amounts of personal income, opportunities to develop professional relationships, and glimpses of what economic freedom might offer. Some eventually saved enough money to purchase their own freedom or that of family members. Sunday was typically designated as a day of rest. Though rest is a relative term when your daily existence requires constant vigilance, and when your body carries the accumulated exhaustion of years. Sundays provided time for community gathering, for maintaining family relationships, for small personal projects that might improve living conditions in the quarters. Market days in nearby towns offered opportunities for those enslaved people who were permitted to sell vegetables they had grown in small garden plots or items they had crafted during whatever free time they could find. These economic activities provided tiny amounts of personal income and brief tastes of something approaching normal commercial relationships. The hiring out system created a complex economic relationship where enslaved people worked for wages that were paid to their owners. These arrangements could last for weeks, months, or even years, temporarily separating families while providing owners with steady income streams that required minimal direct supervision. Urban slavery differed from plantation bondage in several significant ways. Enslaved people in cities often lived in closer proximity to free people of color and white residents, creating opportunities for different types of social interaction and cultural exchange. They might work as domestic servants, artisans, laborers, or in small manufacturing operations. The docks and warehouses of port cities employed many enslaved workers who loaded and unloaded the ships that carried produced goods to markets around the world. These workers developed strong backs and practical skills while handling the very products of their bondage: bales of cotton, barrels of rice, hogsheads of tobacco and sugar. Free time, when it existed, was precious and carefully used. Enslaved people crafted furniture for their own quarters, tended small gardens that supplemented their rations, made clothing and shoes that provided better protection than what was distributed by their owners, and maintained family and community relationships that provided emotional sustenance. Courtship and marriage within the enslaved community followed patterns that adapted traditional practices to the constraints of bondage. Couples might jump the broom in ceremonies that their community recognized as legitimate, even when the law provided no protection for their unions. These relationships provided emotional support and practical cooperation that made survival more feasible. Childbirth in the quarters was attended by experienced women who had learned midwifery through necessity and practice. Infant mortality rates were high. Malnutrition affected pregnant women, and newborns entered a world where their future was already determined by their mother's legal status. Children learned early that their world operated by rules that made no logical sense, that skin color determined legal status, that their parents' love could not protect them from separation, that their intelligence and talents would be valued only insofar as they contributed to someone else's prosperity. The auction block represented the most visible symbol of slavery's horror, the place where human beings were inspected like livestock, separated from families and sold to the highest bidder. Auctioneers developed techniques for presenting their human merchandise in ways that maximized prices, while potential buyers examined teeth, muscles, and scars to evaluate the productive potential of the people they considered purchasing. Estate sales, when plantation owners died, often resulted in the complete dissolution of enslaved communities that had developed over generations. Families who had lived and worked together for decades might be scattered across different states, never to see each other again, as executors converted human property into cash to settle debts and distribute inheritances. The psychological impact of bondage was profound and lasting. The daily experience of being treated as property, of having no legal rights, of knowing that your children could be sold away from you, created trauma that extended far beyond the physical demands of forced labor. Yet resilience also characterized the enslaved community's response to their circumstances. Cultural traditions were maintained and adapted. Family bonds were preserved despite legal obstacles. Educational aspirations survived despite prohibitions. Dreams of freedom persisted despite overwhelming evidence that the system was designed to be permanent. The economy of the young United States was built on the foundation of unpaid labor, extracted from millions of enslaved people. The profits generated by their work flowed not only to individual plantation owners, but into the broader economic systems that financed industrialization, trade, and territorial expansion. By the dawn of the 1800s, the enslaved population had grown to nearly 1 million people, most of whom had been born in America and had never known freedom. Their labor had transformed wilderness into profitable agricultural regions, built cities, cleared forests, constructed roads, and created wealth that would persist for generations. The daily reality of bondage was that each sunrise brought another day of labor without compensation, another day of living at the mercy of others' decisions, another day of enduring a system that treated human beings as economic units rather than as people with inherent worth and dignity. Yet within these constraints, enslaved communities created lives of meaning, maintained hope for the future, and preserved the humanity that bondage sought to deny. The legacy of these daily experiences extends far beyond the formal end of slavery. The resilience, creativity, and strength developed through centuries of bondage became foundations for subsequent struggles for civil rights, economic opportunity, and social justice. The communities forged in the quarters became the basis for institutions that would serve African American communities for generations. Understanding the daily lives of enslaved people requires recognizing both the systematic cruelty of the institution and the remarkable humanity of those who survived it. Their stories are not simply tales of victimization, but also accounts of people who maintained dignity, created culture, preserved families, and never stopped believing that they deserved better than the circumstances that confined them. The morning horn that began each day in bondage was also, in its way, a daily reminder that another day of endurance had been completed, another day of survival achieved, another day closer to whatever freedom might eventually come. In the quarters, as families stirred to face another day of forced labor, they carried with them the accumulated strength of their ancestors, the love of their communities, and the persistent hope that bondage was not the end of their story. Each day began the same way it would end, with people who had been legally defined as property, demonstrating through their very existence that they were, in fact, human beings whose lives had meaning, whose suffering mattered, and whose dreams of freedom would ultimately prove stronger than the chains that bound them. The seasonal rhythms that governed agricultural work created different patterns of bondage throughout the year. Spring brought planting season, when the soil had to be prepared and seeds placed with precision that would determine the year's harvest. The work began before dawn and continued until darkness made further labor impossible. Hands that had grown soft during winter's relative quiet quickly developed new caluses as hoes, plows, and other implements reclaimed their familiar grip. Summer intensified every aspect of field labor. The sun that nurtured growing crops also created an furnace under which human bodies labored without respite. Water breaks were brief and carefully timed, not for the workers' comfort, but to prevent the economic loss that would result from heat exhaustion or death. Clothing that had provided modest protection during cooler months became instruments of torture, trapping heat and moisture against skin already pushed beyond its limits. Harvest time brought its own particular urgency and exhaustion. Crops had to be gathered at precisely the right moment to maximize their value, creating work schedules that stretched human endurance to its breaking point. Cotton bolls that had ripened overnight could not wait for convenient daylight hours. Rice that had reached perfect maturity would spoil if left unharvested. The economic imperatives that drove these decisions took no account of the human cost required to meet them. Winter offered the closest approximation to rest that enslaved people would experience, but even this season brought its own labor requirements. Firewood had to be cut and split to heat the master's house. Repairs that had been postponed during growing season now demanded attention. Tools required maintenance and replacement. The brief respite from field work was filled with tasks that prepared for the next agricultural cycle. The domestic work that maintained plantation households was invisible to most observers, but essential to the functioning of these agricultural enterprises. Cooking for large numbers of people over open fires required skills and strength that few possessed. Laundry involved hauling water, heating it over fires, scrubbing clothing by hand, and hanging everything to dry regardless of weather conditions. Cleaning the master's house meant maintaining standards of cleanliness and order that exceeded anything possible in the quarters. Fine furniture had to be dusted and polished. Floors required sweeping and mopping. Windows needed washing. Silver had to be cleaned and polished. Every surface, every object, every corner of the house reflected not only on the family's social status, but also on the competence of the enslaved people responsible for its maintenance. Child care within enslaved families required constant negotiation between the demands of parents' work schedules and children's needs. Mothers who labored in fields from dawn to dusk had to find ways to feed infants, comfort crying children, and provide the emotional nurturing that growing minds and hearts required. Extended family networks and community support systems evolved to meet these needs, with grandmothers, aunts, and older children sharing responsibilities that individual parents could not fulfill alone. The education that occurred within enslaved communities happened entirely outside official channels and often in direct violation of laws that prohibited teaching enslaved people to read or write. Parents who had somehow acquired literacy shared their knowledge with their children in whispered lessons after exhausting workdays. Community members who possessed skills in arithmetic, writing, or reading created informal schools that met in secret locations and dissolved quickly when discovery threatened. Religious life provided one of the few spaces where enslaved communities could gather in large numbers and express themselves with relative freedom. The spirituals that emerged from these gatherings encoded messages about resistance, escape routes, and hope for liberation that could be sung openly without alerting white listeners to their true meanings. Biblical stories of Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt resonated with particular power among people who understood bondage as a lived experience rather than ancient history. The Underground Railroad represented the most organized form of resistance to slavery, but its success depended on countless individual acts of courage by people who risked everything to help others achieve freedom. Station masters, conductors, and passengers all understood that capture meant severe punishment or death. Yet the network continued to operate because the dream of freedom proved stronger than the fear of consequences. Local resistance took forms that were less dramatic, but equally important to the daily survival of enslaved communities. Work slowdowns, tool breakage, and feigned illness were common responses to particularly harsh treatment or impossible demands. These actions required careful calculation, as their success depended on appearing accidental or unavoidable, rather than deliberate acts of defiance. The hiring out system created complex relationships that sometimes provided enslaved people with greater autonomy, while simultaneously generating additional profits for their owners. Skilled artisans might work for wages in nearby towns, developing professional relationships and learning new techniques, while most of their earnings flowed back to the plantation. These arrangements could last for months or years, creating temporary separations from families, while offering glimpses of what economic freedom might provide. Urban slavery presented different challenges and opportunities than rural bondage. Enslaved people in cities often lived in closer proximity to free blacks and whites, creating possibilities for different types of social interaction and cultural exchange. They might work as domestic servants, artisans, laborers, or in small manufacturing operations that served urban markets. The ports of Charleston, New Orleans, New York, and other coastal cities employed thousands of enslaved workers who loaded and unloaded the ships that carried produced goods to markets around the world. These workers developed intimate knowledge of global commerce while handling the very products of their bondage: bales of cotton destined for textile mills, barrels of rice bound for European kitchens, hogsheads of sugar that would sweeten tables they would never sit at. Market days provided rare opportunities for some enslaved people to engage in small-scale commerce, selling vegetables they had grown in garden plots or items they had crafted during whatever free time they could create. These transactions, though limited in scope, offered brief experiences of normal economic relationships and tiny amounts of personal income that could be used to improve living conditions or purchase small luxuries. The legal framework that supported slavery created a parallel universe of law where human beings could be owned, bought, sold, and treated as any other form of property. Slave codes defined the boundaries of acceptable behavior for both enslaved people and their owners, though enforcement was uneven and often depended more on local customs than written statutes. Marriage between enslaved people had no legal recognition, meaning that families could be separated at will, and that promises made during wedding ceremonies carried no legal weight. Yet these relationships provided emotional support and practical cooperation that made survival more feasible, and the communities that witnessed these unions typically treated them as legitimate regardless of their legal status. Pregnancy among enslaved women was viewed primarily through an economic lens, as children would increase the owner's wealth regardless of the emotional bonds that formed between parent and child. Pregnant women typically worked until the day they gave birth and returned to full labor as soon as they were physically able, with minimal accommodation for the physical demands of pregnancy or recovery from childbirth. The breeding of enslaved people was discussed and implemented with the same clinical detachment applied to livestock improvement. Women of childbearing age were valued not only for their current labor, but for their reproductive potential. Men might be selected for breeding purposes based on their physical characteristics, skills, or perceived genetic advantages. Medical care within enslaved communities relied heavily on folk medicine and traditional healing practices passed down through generations. Elderly women who had learned herbal remedies from their mothers and grandmothers became the community's primary healthcare providers, using plants, roots, and techniques that often proved more effective than treatments available from white physicians. The psychological impact of bondage extended far beyond the physical demands of forced labor. The daily experience of being treated as property, of having no legal rights, of knowing that loved ones could be sold away without warning, created trauma that affected not only those who experienced it directly, but their children and grandchildren as well. Death in the quarters was marked by rituals that blended African traditions with Christian practices and American innovations. Funeral ceremonies provided opportunities for community gathering and emotional expression that were rarely permitted under other circumstances. These events honored the deceased, while also affirming the humanity and dignity that bondage sought to deny. The auction block represented, perhaps the most visible and traumatic symbol of slavery's horror. Here, human beings were inspected like livestock, their teeth examined, their muscles tested, their scars evaluated as indicators of their capacity for labor or resistance. Families who had lived together for decades might be separated forever as auctioneers sold them to different buyers scattered across vast geographic distances. Estate sales, triggered by the death of plantation owners, often resulted in the complete dissolution of enslaved communities that had developed over generations. People who had known each other since childhood, who had worked together through countless seasons, who had shared joys and sorrows through decades of bondage, might find themselves scattered across different states with no hope of ever reuniting. The economic impact of slavery extended far beyond individual plantations to shape the entire economy of the young United States. The profits generated by unpaid labor flowed into banking systems, manufacturing enterprises, shipping companies, and countless other businesses that depended directly or indirectly on slave-produced goods. Northern merchants, southern planters, and European traders all participated in economic networks that were built on the foundation of human bondage. By 1800, the enslaved population had grown to nearly 1 million people, most of whom had been born in America and had never known freedom. Their labor had cleared forests, drained swamps, built cities, constructed roads, and created agricultural systems that generated enormous wealth for others, while leaving them with nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever small possessions they could accumulate and protect. The cultural legacy of enslaved communities extended far beyond their immediate circumstances to influence American music, language, cuisine, and artistic expression. Spirituals, work songs, and other musical forms that emerged from bondage became foundations for blues, jazz, and other musical traditions that would eventually gain international recognition and appreciation. Storytelling traditions maintained connections to African heritage while adapting to American experiences. Folk tales featuring clever protagonists who outwitted more powerful opponents provided entertainment, while also encoding lessons about survival and resistance. These stories passed from generation to generation, preserving cultural memory and community wisdom. The end of each day brought exhaustion that penetrated to the bone, but it also brought the precious hours of darkness, when families could gather, when quiet conversations could take place, when small acts of love and care could be exchanged away from the watchful eyes of overseers and masters. These moments of relative privacy were treasured not for their comfort, but for their reminder that humanity persisted despite systematic attempts to crush it. Each sunrise brought another day of bondage, but it also brought another day of survival, another day of maintaining dignity in the face of dehumanization, another day of keeping alive the hope that freedom would eventually come. In the quarters, as people stirred to face another day of forced labor, they carried with them the strength of their ancestors, the support of their communities, and the unshakable belief that their lives had meaning beyond their economic value to others.